Hello, and welcome to The Gathering. We're glad you've joined us for today's message. For more information about The Gathering, visit our website, www.gatheringtohim.org, or find us on Facebook. We hope you are blessed, encouraged, and empowered by today's message.
All right, good morning, church. Welcome to the gathering today. Anybody feel uncomfortable with the silence and waiting? In our culture, we're used to moving and talking and never having any quiet time, but quiet time before the Lord is important and it's special. And so anyhow, thank you, worship team, that I appreciate that. Waiting before the Lord is a good thing. Because I try and help the Lord out too much instead of waiting at times. So I don't know if anybody else can identify with that, but amen. We have one announcement this morning, and that is our annual business meeting / visioning meeting. We should change that, vision/business meeting, because the visioning part is the important part of that meeting, at least in my book. So that will be Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. We will go over accounting for the church finances, what things did, where things went the last year, and then also for envisioning for this coming year. So Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. Does anybody else have anything? I did not see any children. You're up, brother. Would you join me in welcoming our long-traveled brother this morning?
Good morning. You'll have to bear with my voice. If you don't like it, I guess there's nothing I can do about it. But I did say, Pastor Scott, I don't think I can speak. And he said, no, you're going to have to. So he wouldn't let me off. I was a little disappointed. We went away on this trip and I had put out the call for everybody to pray, and two things I was disappointed in. Number one is, that you guys, in your time of prayer for me, you didn't discern that I needed prayer protection from sickness. And so I was upset about that. And then the second thing was I had asked specifically that we wouldn't miss any of our, transitions between trains and planes and everything. And we missed one. And so I thought these people, their hearts are far from me. And so I was upset. So I do appreciate everyone praying. We had a good trip. It really was, up until the point where I got on the train to come home from Ukraine. And when we got on the train, that's when I got sick. And got pretty sick at that time. But before that, everything went really well. And everything was going good. I got hit pretty hard. It felt like I was being attacked. And I got pretty sick. Probably one of the worst times of travel that I've ever had is coming home. But I was so glad to get to Germany and then so glad to get back here. It's because I was sick. Excuse me. But I did want to share a little bit about what had went on in Ukraine. And, we got there. We had been invited, by the way, for those of you who don't know, on Christmas Eve, I got the phone call. Actually, it was Randy Lemley who called me, and he said, listen, we got this invitation to go Ukraine. They call him Rabbi Boris, or, he's Pastor Boris, or whatever you want to say, but leader of this church over there, but he had invited us to come and extended this invitation. And anyway, I said, well, when do you need to know by? And he said, well, like tomorrow. It's Christmas Eve. I mean, I don't know how many of you have ever thought you'd get a phone call at a time like that, to go into a place like that and have a time frame to decide like that. But I had one day, to make the decision, basically, a day and a half. And, of course, we had Christmas, and I was asking for prayer. But we had probably traveled, I believe there were 8 flights, about that many train rides, and I'm not sure how many car rides. Excuse me. There was a lot of transition, a lot of traveling. When we were on our way home, I said we had missed our one train. I got sick on the night. Would have been Saturday night. We just got on the train, and we were riding all night long, and I was growing worse and worse all night long. And we finally got it to Poland. That train took us all the way from Kyiv in Ukraine to the border, which was at Poland. And so when we got there, we're supposed to make another train transition from one train to the other, but they wouldn't let us off our train because they held us there for so long. Just about everybody on that train missed their next train. And so imagine the dumb Americans who don't know how to speak any of the languages that they're throwing out at the time. And we have to find our way off this train and out of there, find our way back to this train station, get new tickets, and make sure they're the right tickets that will get us back into the Poland airport, fly to Germany at the right time, because we already had, everything was already set up, so we missed that. Anyway, God took care of us. But I was sick. I was miserable. So, with that being said, the church there as a whole, they were having a conference. It was a prayer conference. And so their prayer conference was set up. Basically, they do this 4 times a year, and it lasts an entire week, 4 times a year. And they go from Monday to Saturday, and this is their schedule. About 10:30, they get together in the morning. They go until 3 in the afternoon. They take a 2-hour break. They come back at 5 o'clock and go till 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening. And they do this every day. And then, the first day we're there, so there's supposed to be a break between 3 and 5, so they basically stop the meetings, and somehow they continue going on worshiping and dancing for 2 hours, and then go right back into the meetings. And I thought, man, we could use some of that hunger. So I wanted to share a couple of the videos. These guys, you want to go ahead and play them. We'll stop and talk about each one. You might want to kill that one light there. So that's just a small sample of them doing what they call, I don't even know what they call it, but it's basically choreographed, like Russian line dancing. I don't know what to call it. But basically that's what it is. I mean, they just dance for hours and hours and hours and hours. And the expectation is that you dance too. Everybody dances. And so they have the whole, that area that they have open for dancing is much larger than this sanctuary. And the church is a church of probably, I don't know normally, 3,000 to 4,000 or 5,000 people, but they, it was like for this conference, about 1,000 people were showing up every day, so there's a good many people there, but the dancing never stops, and very passionate about that. And of course, there's also a lot of, these are if I don't know if you know this, but in Ukraine is one of the largest Jewish populations, displaced Jews who, from years past. But so many of them have gotten saved, and these are like Messianic Jewish congregations. They're not all Jewish, but they have a lot of Jewish flavor to them, and the songs that they sing and the dances that they do, and it's pretty interesting. So, and you see some of the, the yarmulkes and the caps that they wear, and so some of them like to do that. But you want to go on to the next video? You hear that horn? That's not like a French horn or a trumpet or whatever. That's actually a shofar. It's like the best I've ever heard anybody ever blow a shofar. But it's like the ram's horn, shofar. And so they're blowing this throughout the meeting. And the whole point of what they were doing right there was that they were in prayer, crying out, and praying over. So if you saw in the middle of the screen, oftentimes they would do this. They'd put up the surrounding European nations of the world, and they would point out certain ones and call them out, vision that they had for it, to send new people to start up new congregations, to birth new works in each one of those areas. And so they're crying out and also pulling down strongholds. And so when you look, excuse me, you see their maps. Excuse me. Here they are in war. They're in the middle of war, and they have vision to launch out, vision to see the gospel of Christ go out into other nations. And you have to understand, we had one time where there was sirens, like air raid sirens that went off. One time the electricity, went off for a short season, and we got caught in an elevator, and doors closed and the electricity went out, and it's kind of funny, and but it wasn't very long we were in there. And anyway, but you look outside, there's this air raid sirens. I went out on my balcony, I'm looking out, and everybody's just going about doing their thing. I'm like looking in the sky, I don't see anything, but it's just like everybody was going on about their business as if nothing had changed. But my point is, like, these people are in the midst of a war-torn country, and they're believing for God to expand their territory and them to take more ground for the kingdom of God. Not even, it's just mind-boggling to me, thinking about that. They're not like, oh, God, save us. We're poor, pitiful people, But they're there celebrating and worshiping Jesus and declaring his praise and going on with a prayer conference and believing for God to do these miraculous things. They also were praying for God to break the war and, all of those things. But you have to understand, just the faith and watching that, it was encouraging to me, to see that around the world. We'll go ahead and run that next video. yeah, so that's basically it. But the interesting thing is all these, I mean, I had so many videos of the various ebbs and flows of the worship, but they would go into, chanting and declaring, and, the whole place is in uproar. They're jumping and shouting, and they're just with one movement, they're declaring certain things. They would have somebody stand up and lead in prayer, but these prayers would go on for hours and hours, and just them believing for God to do, mighty and miraculous things. And so it was a powerful experience. I mean, God had done amazing things while we were there. We got to see, the miraculous of God. And when we arrived, the first day that we arrived, we were pretty tired, but we got there late in the evening. And when we did, Pastor Boris, he stands up and he introduces us, and he introduces Randy, and then Randy kind of again then introduces me. And when he does, he says, this is, calls me, his good friend from Pennsylvania, a pastor, but also he has to go ahead and mention that I'm prophetic. Well, when he does that, apparently it created this stirring. I don't know. I didn't speak. I was never one of the main speakers. I did speak from various times, like to the congregation, but Pastor Boris at the end got up and made these comments about these long lines, and it was true. They were exhausting, but it was like probably till I was done there, I had prayed, or prophesied, I should say. I had prayed and prophesied over 300 to 400 people. And the lines would just never end, and I, they would just keep coming, and but it was a pleasure and a blessing. But the Lord did a lot of miraculous things, and it was powerful. And of course, then when we traveled back to Germany, I ministered there and spoke and ministered to the people there. But it was a real encouragement to be there. There's so many things that had gone on. We had met so there was this one point where Pastor Boris had invited us to come down after the meetings in the evening, come down into these rooms where they were private rooms. He'd invite us in. This is Randy and I, and Randy Lemley. And so we come into this room. We don't know what we're going in there for, why he's calling us in. And we come into this room, we walk in, and there's this older gentleman in there. And it turns out that his name is, and I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him, but his name is David Hathaway. David Hathaway is, has anybody ever heard of David Hathaway in here? Or one person? David Hathaway is like the Reinhard Bonnke of Europe. So Reinhard Bonnke would have been a great evangelist and faith healer within Africa, and led thousands and thousands of people to the Lord. This guy, David Hathaway, is also famous in Europe, and especially the Russian-speaking countries within that region. He's from Great Britain. We walk in the room, and this guy is full of fire. He's 90 years old, and he is full of fire. And he's like, he makes me feel ashamed. Makes me feel ashamed. I mean, he's so fiery, he's so full of faith, and he's excited about the Lord. And he's like, listen, you got to understand. He said, these are the words coming out of his mouth. We barely know the guy. He said, listen, I am not leaving this world. I am not leaving this world until Jesus comes back. I'm not leaving. He's 90 years old. He said, I'm not leaving until Jesus comes back. He said, the only other way I'm leaving is if he sends a chariot of fire for me like he did Elijah. I told the Lord, I'm not leaving any other way. It's one of those two ways. Either I'm going when he comes back, or he's going to say, he said, why not? I said, why not? He said, I mean, why not have the faith for that? Then he says, he's got plans until he's 120, 30 more years. And I'm thinking, this guy, I mean, he looks like he can make it. I'm serious. He's got so much energy and so much life. 90 years old, he doesn't look like, he probably could outrun me. He just looks like he's got so much life-sustaining power within him. And anyway, he laid his hands on me, and he laid his hands on Randy, both of us, and prayed for us. And it was powerful. This guy, I want to share some of the stories that this guy had to share, because we were like, okay, so tell us. We'd like to know some of the highlights of your years of ministry, because he's been in ministry since he was, 18 years old. And he's 90 years old. Think about this guy. This is 72 years. And, he said when he was 17 years old, he was crying out to God. He knew he wasn't old enough to be in ministry yet. He had to be 18 years old before he could be in ministry. And he's crying out to God. And he said, God, don't give my job to somebody else. Don't give my job to somebody else. He says, wait for me. Wait for me. Don't give my job to somebody else. He said, well, now he's 90 years old, and he still cries out, God, don't give my job to somebody else. So the guy's faith was like, I love the guy. He's just stir you up in faith and belief. And so we asked him, what are some of the highlights? And, for ministry for him over the years. He shared several. He said once he was in Russia, and he went into a prison, and I don't know why it slipped my mind, but a really cold place in Russia. Siberia, thank you. So he was in a Siberian prison, and so he went there to visit. The guy that was over the entire prison says to him, what do you think you're doing? He said, there's no hope for these guys. What do you think you're bringing to them? There's nothing you can bring to them. Why have you come here? What's the point? There's not even a point for you to be here. I'm so sorry. I did that in early service. And he said, anyway, he's like, so the guy tells him, you have to understand. He said, there's a large percentage of the people that are in here are mass murderers. A large percentage of the people that are in here, they're rapists. A large percentage of the people in here are lifetime criminals. They're not changing. They're hopeless. And so he had been, you have to understand, and I'm back up a little bit, but David Hathaway was actually arrested in Ukraine back 50 years ago. He was arrested and he was tortured for his faith, for preaching the gospel in Ukraine. And so he was supposed to be in there for more than 10 years. But he said, he began to say to the Lord, Lord, why? He said, if you release Paul and Silas from prison, if you released, Peter, if you release these guys from prison, why not me? And he said, so he began to cry out and say, God, why not me? You can release me too. And so he started praying for it. And he had a vision, he had a dream and a vision where he saw himself preaching at a large venue in Europe, back, I think it was close to Great Britain. And he saw and he saw the date. He knew the date of this event, and it was 4 days after his birthday. He saw him preaching there, and that was less than a year, away. And he said, so he started telling all the prison guards and all the prisoners, he started telling everyone, I'm getting out. The Lord says, I'm getting out. I won't be here in a year. He said, I'll be out of this prison. And they all said he was crazy. And he said about this, his birthday, the day of his birthday, which was 4 days before this event, the day of his birthday, the Prime Minister of Great Britain flew into Ukraine and got him out of prison and put him on his personal plane and flew him back to Great Britain. And what a man of faith, he said, I knew the Lord was taking me out. And he was at that event and spoke at it 4 days later. So he's in the Siberian prison. And he stands up, he says, I knew I had to have a word because here I am being questioned by why I'm here. And so he stands up and he says to the prisoners, there's 1,400 prisoners there listening to him, and he says, listen, I've been in prison like you. And he begins to describe his experiences. He said, I know what it's like for you to be in prison. I've experienced this myself. I know all of these things. He goes on, he says, and what I'm here to tell you today is how to get out of prison. He said when he did that, all the guards perked up. They started looking at him. They got nervous. And all the prisoners perked up and started moving in to hear what he had to say. He said, I'm here today to tell you how to get out of prison. He said, there's 2 ways you can get out of prison. One, he said, we could rush all of these guards, take them over and get out. He said, that's probably not going to go well for you. He said, but number 2, he said, if you want to know how to get out of prison, the best way to get out of prison is to surrender your life to Jesus Christ, to trust in him. And he began to describe to them about the gospel and giving their lives to Jesus Christ. And he said, this is the only way you'll get out of prison. The only way that there's any hope for your life. The only way there's any hope for restoration. He said he only had 1 hour to speak. And he said he had just finished saying those things. He said the last thing he said brought everybody, all of the prisoners, all 1,400 of them fell out under the power of God on their faces before God. And he said that was the last thing as they ushered him out of the room. He said he couldn't see anything. He didn't know what else happened. So he left, and he said about it, a year later, he came back. And when he came back, he found out that 160 some, I'm not even sure how many, but 160 some of them had all become evangelists and pastors and teachers of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and had gotten out of prison, and were going for all the prisons in Russia. We're visiting all the prisons in Russia, sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ with them when he had gotten back. Anyway, it's a pretty big deal. And so then he went on telling stories. He's told lots of stories. Anyway, he said another story was, there was this woman who had had some sort of illness, problems in her legs, and she asked for prayer. He prayed for her. She got healed. And then she began to beg him and say, would you go to the hospital where my husband is? My husband's in the hospital and he's got a broken back. Would you go there and pray for him? And he said, no, I won't go. I'm not going. And she begged him, and he said, no, I'm not going. And so the Holy Spirit then spoke to him and said, you will go. And so he said, okay, I'll go to the hospital. And so he went to the hospital. And when he walked in the room, there was her husband. He laid his hands on him, his broken back. He said his back got healed, and he left the hospital. In the same room, there was another guy who had a broken back, and so he's prayed for him also, and this guy also got healed and left the hospital. He said, so there was one more guy, and the guy was totally blind, and so he laid his hands on him, and the guy's eyes popped open. He said, so he's sitting there in the hospital room, and he gave him his Bible. He gave him his study Bible, and he said, so I left this man, this blind man, in the hospital reading the Gospels. He's reading the Gospels. He can now see, and he's in there, and he said tears are running down his face. He's reading the Gospels. And so he said, I left the hospital. He said, and about a few days later, he said, I received a phone call from the governor or the mayor or whatever of that town that year. And he said, what in the world did you do? He said, you cleaned out the entire hospital. He said, no, I didn't. I didn't clean out the hospital. He said, I went there and prayed for a couple of people. He said, no, you cleaned out the entire hospital. He said, I did not clean out the entire hospital. I don't know what you're talking about. He said, no, you cleaned it. You cleaned out the entire hospital. He said, no, I prayed for only several people. He said, and then all of a sudden it dawned on me. I left that guy sitting there who had his eyes healed, who was reading the Gospels of Jesus Christ, tears running down his face. He said, I believe that guy got faith, saw it in the scriptures, and went around throughout the hospital praying for everybody, and they all got healed and left the hospital. And I want to say this one thing, because traveling to Ukraine, some people said, even Pastor Boris, when I got there, he says, when he announced this, he says, oh, I don't want to announce these brave pastors who have come from the United States, who have come to visit us, who are brave and have come here. And I thought, we don't feel brave, we just being obedient to what we felt the Lord telling us to do, and just felt a peace from God to be there. And but it's interesting, and I will tell you, I put out the call to the congregation, pray for me, trying to decide what to do. And I'll say this, I didn't have anybody from our congregation say, oh my gosh, Pastor, what are you thinking? Don't you dare. Don't do that. Don't. Oh my goodness, maybe you just don't care. I don't know. But most of you, nobody did that. Nobody said to me, and actually I'm thankful that didn't happen. But I put out the call. Excuse me. I put out the call to other people, and I said, some family members and people that I know, and I can't tell you how often I got the response back. What are you thinking? Why would you do this? You better know that you're right. You better know, all these things. And every single word was negative and doubt, throwing doubt at us. And even Randy experienced that. And I just want to say, I think for me, the one thing, this is a big takeaway for me, and the one thing that I feel like that the Lord wants us to get, wants us to understand is that it's not about, our lives and the gospel of Jesus Christ isn't about, when it's convenient for us. It's not about protecting ourselves. It's not about a gospel that is, it's only meant for certain situations. I don't believe that. I believe that Jesus said this. He said very much so, listen, if you want to follow me, he said, if you want to come after me, you've got to die daily. You got to die daily. You got to pick up your cross, and you've got to come after me. And he said, anyone who wants to cling to this life will lose it, but anyone who wants to give up their life, or who is willing to give up their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel, will find it. And I believe that we need what this man, David Hathaway, was, he has something about him that is mind-boggling to me. 90 years old, he's believing God for even more than what he's seen in the past. I hope that at 90 years old, I still have that same kind of passion. And I'm not concerned about my life. Here he is. How did he end up there? I mean, he showed up in Ukraine at the same time, and he's like telling us, these awesome, powerful stories and believing God for mighty, miraculous things. And I want to say to you that I think we want the gospel that is more than just words. Don't we? I want the gospel more than just words. It says in Thessalonians, this is what Paul says, we know, dear brothers and sisters, that God loves you and has chosen you to be his own people. For when we brought you the good news, it was not with words, but also, it was not only with words, but also with power. For the Holy Spirit gave you full assurance that what we said was true. When we got there, walked into the country, I didn't feel any supercharge of anything. I didn't feel like the power of God surging through me. Do you understand what I mean? Like, I didn't feel any of that. We walked in there. Pastor Boris introduces us. I'm a nobody. And he says, listen, come up here, form a line. Form a line. I want you to form lines. And Pastor Randy, you go down that end. And Todd, you go over here at this end. And he says, I want you to start laying hands on people and praying for people. And like I said, I didn't feel any major surge of power, but the Lord said, lay hands on these people. So I started laying hands on them. And the first couple people I laid hands on began to shake under the power of God and fall down violently and roll around on the floor. And others began to laugh. Imagine that. They began to laugh uncontrollably. I didn't feel anything coming upon me, but I just walked up and laid my hands on them. And do you understand? What we brought to you was not just in word only, but also in demonstration of power. And what I'm saying is, I think it begins with the dying to ourselves and not being complacent. I looked at these people and I thought, my goodness, the same power of God that we've experienced here. And the one girl, she was telling me, you got to dance. It's all part of their culture. They dance all constantly. She's like, you got to dance. I was like, okay. So I got involved, I'm dancing. It's like the Jewish, Russian line dancing. I don't know what it is. But anyway, we're just doing it. And nobody cares. Nobody cares. Nobody's judging. They just want to worship the Lord with all their heart, And the thing is, it's not about protecting ourselves. It's not about, one way is right, one way is not. No, what's right is that we give all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, all of our strength. That's what's right. God is interested not in a halfway surrender, a convenient surrender. He's not interested in, like us giving little pieces or parts, but he wants everything. And so the question is, on that day when you receive the phone call, it's Christmas Eve, you're thinking, I don't want to leave the country. It's Christmas, it's New Year's. I don't want to go anywhere. The New Year's Day, I pulled out. You understand what I'm saying? What does I'm not believing that each one of us has to go storming off into danger to experience the power of God. That's not what I mean. It might help. Don't do it unless God says so. But what I am saying is is that we're far too concerned about ourselves. We're far too concerned about what's convenient, what feels good, or what's right, or, we make excuses and we do all these things. And listen, I think I've learned something over this trip. And I think it has to do with the fact that God just wants our surrender. There's no safer place to be for you or me than in the will of God. So if that's in a war-torn country where the, bombs could go off, there's no safer place for me to be than there. Does that make sense? I better be in the will of God. And I want the power of God. It's not just word only, but it's the power of God. But I think the power of God, listen to this. Jesus says, he says, these signs will follow those that believe. Well, I think signs follow. Hard for signs to follow if we're not going anywhere. Hard for signs to follow if we're not moving, if we're not, stepping into places that are uncomfortable or stepping into obedience when the Lord is calling us to it.